the CNN, which it stands for the Colored Negro News Network. And there's several things that I want to just point up about CNN is that they, in the media, if it bleeds, it leads. And they have to have exciting, stimulating stories in order to be able to, keep eyeballs on their particular, on their particular news items. And at first it was the coronavirus going back and starting in March and April. They were on that like white on rice because a lot of people were dying, and it looked like, just people like to see death on television. They love it. They love it. They love it. They can't get enough of it. But then the death of George Floyd, seemingly, according to the CNN reporters and the editors there, that the death of George Floyd was more important than 1,000 people dying a day. And for 21 days, they stopped. For 21 days straight, the Colored News Network stopped covering the coronavirus. When they stopped covering the coronavirus, it was only 90,000 people that had died. When George Floyd died, the number of coronavirus people that had died was only 90,000. Or 85,000, somewhere thereabouts. And they just stopped covering it altogether. They stopped it, they stopped taking down, they started putting up their information, and they covered 24/7 George Floyd and the riots that happened thereafter. Now they're back. George Floyd, right, a man who obviously was killed, he was brutally killed before the entire world agrees that that was an awful thing that happened to George Floyd, and I'm number one. It was terrible, and the guy who lynched him ought to pay the price for having done that. And the world has seen it. But now, having said that, is the death of George Floyd more important than another 35,000 people, women and children, black and white, that have died but didn't get any coverage? Didn't get any coverage. It used to be that here in New York, the Colored News Negro Network, at 7 o'clock in the evening would cover people coming out on their balconies, on their porches, and in their apartments and their windows all over New York City, and ringing bells, celebrating the work of the EMST workers, the hospital workers, the nurses, and the doctors back in March and April. Every evening at 7 o'clock was a major celebration saying thank you to the nurses, thank you to the orderlies, thank you to the doctors. And many of them were dying working in these hospitals, East Elmhurst and many of the other places where people were dying by the gross. And we were so thankful that these brave nurses and brave doctors were going into these hospitals facing that coronavirus death, and many dying themselves to save us. So we cheered every evening. There'd be a religious order of everybody over New York City ringing bells and beating on cups and doing a jig. But when George Floyd died, well, hell, they stopped covering it. When George Floyd died, we stopped giving appreciation to the doctors and to the nurses. The Colored News Network figured, well, the death of George Floyd is more important than the work that these courageous doctors and nurses do on a daily basis, working 14-hour shifts without the proper protection equipment, without masks, without incubators. But George Floyd's death was more important 24/7, and they covered it. All right, we ain't heard no more of the ringing bells. People stopped celebrating at 7 o'clock in the evening. They don't do it no more. The news stopped covering it. They went away. All we see now are a bunch of thugs and hoodlums call themselves Black Lives Matter. All we see are thugs and hoodlums and deserted fathers and deserted children out in the streets carrying Black Lives Matter signs. They started covering that wall to wall rather than covering the courageous and brave work done by the nurses and the doctors in these hospitals in New York City. You say, well, Pastor Manny, the epidemic is past pretty much here in New York. It hadn't passed when they stopped covering it. It hadn't passed. Nurses and doctors are still dying, and people are still dying. You say, well, News about dead colored people, dead black people killed by somebody white is more important, according to CNN, this editorial board, those that decide which stories are to get publicized. Black Lives Matter is now more important than the nurses and the doctors in the hospitals that risk their lives. These nappy-head, dreadlock-wearing, no, if you will, sense father deserters and fatherless without children out there in the street marching with these white sympathizers, these bleeding hearts. All of a sudden, in terms of importance about what should be covered, they're more important than the doctors and the nurses in the hospital. Ain't that nothing? That's what CNN has said, and MSNBC as well. You see? Well, this is an important issue. I know that, maybe, but this is a historical issue. This is history that we owe the black people a lot. And now that we've got cameras and telephones and the ubiquitous cameras everywhere, and Will Smith said that didn't just start, police didn't just start killing black people, it just started being filmed. And so this is historical, and though we sympathize with the hospitals and the nurses and all that courageous work, but we owe the black people this publicity. We owe them, and we can make them or we can not make them. So we owe them, and we're going to give them all this free publicity. So I think that if there was scientific data, that would be how much coverage was given to Black Lives Matter in terms of the economics of it, in terms of, well, just how much would they have to pay for the kind of coverage they've gotten from the Colored Negro News Network in terms of advertising dollars. And then the other question will be, how much money has CNN made as a result of covering these people? I mean, have they been able to jack up their rates for asking Progressive Insurance or, some of the other the drugs that they cover and advertise? Have they jacked up their rates? Have they made special, when they do these specials about crime or this or that and the other, do they charge special rates to be included in that 1 hour of a special with Dr. Sandra Gupta, or whoever the hell it is that they do? I mean, MSNBC the same thing. Are they making more money as well? Is it not just a matter of, well, we bleeding hearts believe that we owe the colored people something, so we're going to cover them and not cover the MST workers, the doctors and nurses and all the orderlies and people in the hospital and everybody else and their families and all their children. We're not going to cover them because we can make more money covering the Negroes. Is that, I'm asking a question. Am I entitled to ask a question? Yes, I think so. So 1,000 deaths per day, and they stopped covering. They stopped informing. I lost track. I started myself every day. I'd give a report because I see it on CNN or MSNBC or something like that, and they stopped covering. So I lost track of how many people were dying because there were nobody cared about the people dying in the coronavirus. Nobody cared about the doctors dying. Nobody cared. All they cared was about George Floyd. And by the way, Floyd is dead now. He's probably upset that Rayshard Brooks got shot, because once Rayshard Brooks got shot, they dropped George Floyd like a hot potato. I guess, thankfully, they put him in the grave soon enough. And the next day, they put George Floyd in the grave. The next day, at the same night, Rayshard Brooks got shot. We ain't heard no more about George Floyd. By the way, what is it with them? Mr. Engineer, do we have some video of George Floyd being put in a white horse-drawn carriage like he's Dr. Martin Luther King or something down about it? I mean, here this guy was dealing dope. Well, I'm not here. Let me not criticize George Floyd. Let me not. But he won't no damn saint, I can tell you that. Here they putting this boy with white horses. It looked like 6 white horses. A white horse drawn for George Floyd. mean, if you get killed by a white man, you get a white horse drawn with white horses, no black horses, a white carriage, no black carriage. You get killed by a white man, here's what every Negro's supposed to get. George Floyd, nobody knew a thing about it. Now he's more popular than Jesus. George Floyd, right? He was. I swear. I'm looking at this stuff and I'm trying to figure out just who the hell is America turning into that there could be, a horse-drawn carriage for George Floyd? Okay, I'm not saying that he should not be buried or that his funeral should not be, but somehow they must have heard something because yesterday, Rayshard Brooks was eulogized at the Ebenezer Baptist Church, the former home of Dr. Martin Luther King's father, Dr. Luther King Jr., a senior rather, and his mother was killed right there on the front pew of the Ebenezer Baptist Church. So yesterday they had Rayshard Brooks' funeral, but they did no coverage. They didn't cover that. They didn't cover that. For whatever reason, they decided they ain't gonna get this boy no cover. We don't know what happened to him. Al Sharpton wasn't there, I guess. They didn't invite Al Sharpton to come, and they didn't invite Ben Crump to come, so the cameras didn't come. Ain't that nothing? Now, Al Sharpton was out there in Minneapolis, he and Ben Crump with his no-talking self. At any rate, my friends, I think that we need to realize that CNN is pimping black people. That's what I come to tell y'all, and after that I won't tell you anything else, but no, that's what they're doing. They love it when y'all get killed. I said some time ago that Al Sharpton loved to hear the news that somebody else been shot by police. That means that at least $3 or $4 million he's gonna make in revenues, in contracts that he's gonna sign with the family, and monies he's gonna get paid. He's gonna get an opportunity to have Tyler Perry give him his private jet. He's gonna be flying around drinking champagne and eating red meat steaks. He loved to hear when a black man gets killed. Lord have mercy. It's time to make some money. It's like the Undertaker. If people don't die, he don't make no money. Sharpton is the Undertaker. He ain't Ben Crump both. But CNN, I'm looking at CNN now, and CNN loves it too. CNN loves it. You don't see CNN covering the graduations of black universities when students graduate. You don't see CNN covering black mothers who are struggling with their children and their fathers are doing well and their husbands, and they left them to root little pig or die. You don't see them covering issues like that. No, they don't cover that. They only cover stuff that will make them money. The ethics of it is not a concern of CNN. So, and they love to see fires. They love to see buildings burning. They're like pyromaniacs. The CNN, they love to see burning. If the looters put a building on fire, CNN will keep that camera there for hours on hours till the building burned down. Then they'll send one of their reporters over there and say the ashes are still smoldering from last night to today. They're pyromaniacs. They love it. They love it. At any rate, everybody, I think that CNN has gone ahead and decided that they're going to devote all their time to covering colored people, Negro people. That's who they consider them as, because they believe that there's a whole lot of money in that, and that people are going to watch it. A lot of Japheth people down in the redneck states are angry when they watch it. Fox gives a little bit of coverage, not much. At any rate, I thought I'd say that. I promised that to y'all yesterday, but I fizzled out at the end of the day. This is a bit of a news blog we do, looking at spiritual wickedness in high places for the most part, making some observations about it and giving people a biblical foundation to the way of interpreting, rather than have Sean Hannity or Laura Ingraham or Janine Pirro or Anderson Cooper or Rachel Maddow or Don Lemon, Rush Limbaugh interpret what's going on in the world. You come to me and I'll tell you based on what the Word of God says. They'll just give you their worldly, sinful view. But the Manning Report will tell you what God has said, whether to say yea or nay, whether to go or to stay. You'll be led by the word of Almighty God. Come to the Manning Report on a daily basis to interpret the spiritual wickedness in high places, because there's plenty of it that's going on. And so I am he. I'm the Lord's servant, James David Righteous Rebel Manning. And I'm here to serve you with news and information.